born into royal blood yet cursed by a skull filled with water and bones that barely held their form. This monarch's tragic existence shattered the illusion of divine perfection. How did inbreeding and dark secrets craft a man whose very body betrayed his throne? Discover the horrific truth behind an empire's collapse and a king's agony drowned in his own morbid curse. In the heart of 16th century Europe, the Habsburg Dynasty reigned supreme, a family whose empire stretched across vast territories, from Spain to the Holy Roman Empire and beyond. Their dominance was sustained not only by military prowess, but also by strategic marriages within royal bloodlines. This relentless inbreeding, designed to keep power concentrated, forged a lineage marked by great kings and queens, but also by ominous genetic curses. Among these was Charles II of Spain, a monarch whose reign would epitomize the catastrophic consequences of such bloodline manipulation, long before his body betrayed him. Born in 1661, Charles II was the product of decades of consanguinity. His parents, both first cousins and part of a family tradition of union between close relatives, inadvertently set the stage for his devastating physical and mental afflictions. His family tree resembled a twisted labyrinth, each branch looped perilously back upon another. This excessive intermarriage not only tightened the family's political grip, but also seeded a genetic storm that would soon wreak havoc upon the kingdom's future. From the glory of Habsburg might to the shadows of inherited weakness, the young prince's existence diverged sharply from expectations. His forebearers were known for commanding armies, signing peace treaties, and ruling with the perceived blessing of God. Yet Charles was born with an unmistakable difference, a skull so malformed his doctors named his condition hydrocephalus, or water on the brain. In truth, his cranial cavity was swollen with fluid, his bones unusually fragile and soft, a grim testament to generations of genetic misfortune resulting from his family's bloodline politics. Despite the kingly gloss and finery, rumors whispered through the corridors of power about the boy's weak constitution and developmental delays. Where once there was hope of strength and vitality, the future king's body seemed to betray his crown almost from the start. The Habsburg ambition clashed with stark biological reality. Charles's physical weaknesses were grotesquely visible. He had an elongated face, jaw so recessed it barely supported his lips, a condition later named Habsburg Jaw, and an almost translucent skin that betrayed the tenuous state of his bones beneath. This fragile vessel would carry the hopes of a sprawling empire, but it was a vessel destined to shatter. His tutors described him as slow, speech delayed, and health perpetually fragile, forcing his sovereignty to be questioned even before his coronation. The magic of royal birthright was eclipsed by the ominous seeds of doom encoded in his very DNA. The political stakes were monumental. Spain's vast overseas empire, rich with gold, silver, and strategic ports, hinged on the capacity of a king to lead, command respect, and produce heirs to carry forward the dynasty. That Charles could neither rule with vigor nor secure his succession spelled danger for the geopolitical map of Europe. As Charles grew, so too did fears about the future of Habsburg Spain. Could this fragile man hold the weight of an empire, or would his death ignite a war for succession and fragment continental power? The looming question haunted courtiers and commoners alike. What empire stands when its king is a powder keg of physical frailty and genetic torment? These shadows of doubt would only deepen as Charles's body worsened, setting the stage for an epic tragedy that would encapsulate the perils of inbreeding, royal pride, and mortal fragility. If you find the twisted fate of the Habsburg dynasty compelling, don't forget to subscribe for more gripping stories. Tell us which other royal tragedies should we unravel next? The chilling story of Charles II is only the beginning. Stay with us as we peel back the layers of a king's delicate crown and the burden it carried. Charles II's frailty was not hidden for long. From the moment of his birth, the infant prince was a fragile enigma to those around him. His skull was notably swollen, an unnerving bulge that doctors struggled to understand or treat. Water trapped in his brain distorted his features and clouded the developing mind within, marking him as a morbid figure even among the gaudy splendor of the Spanish court. To protect the royal image, the palace physicians imposed strict secrecy around the boy's condition. Scattered reports reached noble ears of strange deformities and delayed milestones. But in public, the court maintained a facade of invincibility. The paradox of a king born to embody power, yet crippled by disease, was dangerous knowledge, and so it was concealed with utmost care. As years passed, the signs grew impossible to ignore. Charles's first steps were late, and his speech came painfully slowly, frustrated parents and tutors alike. His unsteady gait and jerky movements betrayed neurological damage. Court physicians whispered of hydrocephalus, but rumors among the people spun tales darker than any diagnosis curses. Divine punishment for sins hidden in the royal bloodline, or even tools of enemies seeking to delegitimize the king. The daily reality was a relentless struggle to disguise Charles's weaknesses behind carefully chosen appearances, ceremonial robes, and curtains drawn against public view. Even as a child, his imposing titles were a hollow echo in the face of his fragile, defective body. One key incident marked a turning point. When Charles was barely a boy, an incident during a hunting trip endangered his life and revealed just how vulnerable he truly was. While astride a horse, the young prince lost control, tumbling violently and hitting his head with a sickening crack that sent the court into frantic panic. His skull, already compromised, fractured in places only barely protected by thin bone. The hidden hydrocephalus worsened, and the swelling inside his brain increased, turning the watery cavity into a ticking time bomb. The royal physicians intensified their attempts to cover up the incident, forbidding spread of reports and coddling Charles in isolation. Yet the physical damage was irreversible. The fragile king's body was slipping steadily towards collapse. Behind closed doors, the palace became a place of hushed urgency. The king's mother and advisors convened endless gatherings, desperate searches for any remedy that could conceal or slow the deterioration. The pressures to cloak vulnerability among the ruling elite brought grim burdens to servants and nobles sworn to secrecy. Any whisper of weakness could be seized by foreign enemies eager to destabilize Spain's dominance. The court's intricate dance of concealment became as fragile as Charles's bones and elaborate charade, masking the fragility inside the royal cradle. As the boy king struggled more with basic functions, the first inklings of political tremors appeared. The fragile infant had become a symbol of a potentially fractured empire, yet no one at court dared to speak openly of his condition. Would the collapse of a king's body be the first sign of a kingdom's ruin? The question hung heavy, and the moment had already come when concealment could no longer stave off disaster. Charles's body was beginning to betray not only himself, but the nation he was born to rule. The story darkened still. Next, we will uncover how this fragile monarchy began to crumble under the weight of its king's physical and political affliction. The kingdom of Spain, once a colossus ruling over oceans and continents, began to show cracks that mirrored the fragile body of King Charles II. The monarch's physical limitations rapidly evolved into a political contagion, weakening his grip on power and sowing seeds of instability that resonated throughout Europe. The court secrecy could only mask the decay for so long. Rivals watched and waited, while domestic unrest brewed beneath a facade of pomp and ceremony. Charles was incapable of producing an heir, a fatal blow to any dynasty reliant on orderly succession. Over his 39 years on the throne, multiple marriages and numerous attempts to secure offspring ended frustratingly in failure, deepening the crisis of continuity. Without a healthy heir, the delicate balance of power in Europe wavered. Families like the Bourbons and Habsburgs eyed Spain's territories hungrily, preparing for the inevitable scramble that would follow the king's demise. This uncertainty weakened Spain's alliances and emboldened its enemies, accelerating its political decline. On the battlefield, Spain's once feared armies began to falter. Charles lacked the vitality and focus to direct military campaigns or rally his commanders effectively. Defeats followed. The war with France dragged on with humiliating losses, while rebellions in distant colonies erupted with increasing frequency. The kingdom's finances, long strained by costly wars and extravagant court expenses, crumbled under the pressure. Political corruption and factionalism flourished, further destabilizing the government. The physical weakness of the king was a symbol of the empire's rot, a clear sign to internal and external observers alike that Spain's golden age was ending. Court intrigues intensified, with nobles and advisors jockeying for favor in an atmosphere heavy with fear and suspicion. The king's fragile mental state made him malleable, increasingly reliant on favorites and sycophants, who often pursued their self-interest at the expense of the realm. Factions formed around different noble houses, each propagating rumors and conspiracies that poisoned governance. The king, caught in his own decaying body and increasingly limited in communication, became a mere puppet controlled by competing interests. This erosion of royal authority accelerated the empire's fragmentation. Outside the palace walls, common people suffered the ramifications. Economic hardship deepened as taxes rose to finance feudal wars. Bread shortages sparked riots and unrest. The once proud Spanish identity, forged in conquest and faith, dulled under a cloud of despair. The inbred king who could neither strengthen his kingdom nor father an heir had become a symbol of decline itself. Scholars and courtiers debated openly in hushed tones whether the dynasty, once thought immortal, was doomed to collapse with the death of Charles. The political infection was no longer hidden. The link between the king's bodily corruption and the empire's unraveling was evident to all but the most blind courtiers. What came next would be the tragic crescendo, the agonizing decline of a monarch whose very flesh betrayed the fate of a nation. The nightmare was only beginning, but the king's physical suffering was soon to match the political chaos engulfing Spain. As the years dragged on, King Charles II's condition deteriorated into a grotesque spectacle of human frailty. His body, once a secret to the public, now bore the unmistakable signs of a man profoundly cursed. The skull filled with fluid expanded relentlessly, deforming his face and head. His bones grew weaker, thin as porcelain, some partially liquefied beneath his fragile skin, giving the eerie impression of a living skeleton. Wherever he went, a faint sour smell of decay seemed to cling to him, a mixture of infections and festering wounds his doctors struggled in vain to control. Pain racked the king constantly, sending him into fits of agony inconceivable to courtiers used to displays of regal strength. The king's movements became increasingly distorted and jerky, with spasms that left him unable to stand or even sit without assistance. Drooling and slurred speech replaced any semblance of eloquence. His jaw, whose malformation had long been a trademark of the Habsburg line, now barely supported his mouth, causing chronic difficulty eating and speaking. The combination of neurological impairment and chronic infection was a relentless torment, turning the once proud ruler into a shadowy figure confined largely to his bedchamber. The spectacle was so disturbing that many courtiers avoided the king to hide their revulsion, while others remained smitten by superstition, believing his suffering marked a punishment divine and absolute. The horror escalated dramatically during a public incident that changed Spain's history. At a royal ceremony attended by foreign dignitaries, Charles attempted to present himself, desperate to project strength despite his worsening condition. Suddenly, his legs buckled, and he collapsed forward, unconscious and convulsing. The crowd gasped as attendants rushed to catch him. The visual tableau of a king incapacitated, shattering any remaining illusions of regal invulnerability. Whispers erupted of madness, curses, and the end of an era. This public collapse was not merely a personal tragedy, it was a political earthquake. Spain's enemies seized the moment, ramping up their propaganda and political maneuvering. The king's incapacitation was evidence enough that Spain's mighty hand was faltering. The medical crisis was compounded by a botched attempt at surgery, a desperate last measure to relieve the pressure inside the king's skull. Imperial doctors, working with the limited and primitive knowledge of the era, attempted to drain the accumulated fluid through trepanation, drilling a hole in the skull. The operation, conducted under unsanitary conditions without anesthesia, was excruciating and largely ineffective. Charles nearly died under the surgeon's knife, and subsequent infections worsened his pain and weakness. The grotesque wounds left by the procedure never fully healed, festering with foul-smelling discharge that lingered long after. His entourage, who tried desperately to shield the evidence from the eyes of the public and foreign observers, found themselves powerless against the unfolding nightmare. Court rumors and foreign spies circulated graphic accounts of the botched surgery, amplifying Spain's image as a decaying empire ruled by a cursed and dying king. The tragic crescendo of physical horror and political pressure overwhelmed the palace, signaling that the final chapter of Charles's reign was about to be written in blood and misery. Yet the king's suffering was far from over. The painful decline dragged on, feeding a growing despair among his subjects and heralding a dark era for Spanish history. The medical practices surrounding King Charles II during his prolonged decline reflected the brutal and often barbaric state of 17th century medicine, a strange blend of superstition, trial and error, and rudimentary science. When faced with his horrifying condition, bone decay, hydrocephalus, and neurological decliner, royal doctors resorted to treatments that ranged from the grotesque to the desperate, often exacerbating his misery. Physicians, alchemists, and ecclesiastical healers all converged upon Charles's chambers in an attempt to find a cure, but their remedies were as cruel as they were futile. Bloodletting, then a common medical practice, was applied repeatedly to the king in hopes of balancing bodily humors. Large quantities of blood were drained from him, a practice now known to weaken patients rather than heal them. Leech therapy, another favorite of the era, was employed to suck out supposed toxins, while purgatives and enemas were forced down his throat to expel evil humors believed to cause disease. These treatments left Charles emaciated and fatigued, often provoking violent nausea and further confusion. Physicians were trapped in the medical paradigms of humoral theory, unable to recognize the metabolic crises caused by his physical condition. Superstition and religious intervention compounded the torment. The king was subjected to numerous prayers, exorcisms, and blessings in the hope that divine intervention would heal his afflictions. Pilgrimages and relic viewings were arranged to invoke miraculous cures, but these spiritual attempts only underscored the helplessness of medicine at the time. Some courtiers whispered of witchcraft or a curse on the king, feeding a climate of fear and uncertainty that further isolated the monarch. The most harrowing interventions lay in experimental surgeries, none more infamous than the trepanation to relieve intracranial pressure. This procedure was conducted repeatedly, despite the high risk of infection, blood loss, and sheer agony. Without antiseptics or anesthetics, the king endured repeated drills into his fragile skull, exacerbating pain and leaving him vulnerable to horrific infections. Doctors employed increasingly elaborate concoctions of herbs, minerals, and animal substances, sometimes poisoning rather than healing. The treatment rooms resembled chambers of horror, where pain was a constant companion and hope a fading, cruel illusion. As the king's strength ebbed away, medical attendants grew reckless or indifferent, some slipping into neglect or outright cruelty under the immense pressure to save a monarch who was, by then, little more than a shell. The line between care and torture blurred. Yet despite the dark science and desperate cures, Charles's condition worsened inexorably. The dynasty's pride and the hope of Spain's survival were pinned on a fragile king, beaten down by both his body and the deadly ignorance of the era's medicine. This brutal chapter of suffering raises haunting questions. How much did the limits of contemporary medicine contribute to Charles's demise? And what might modern science reveal about the true nature of his ailment and the causes behind a royal tragedy unlike any other? Prepare to uncover the grisly finale and the forensic revelations that finally decode the mystery of a king drowned in water and liquid bones. King Charles II's death in 1680 was a grim denouement to nearly 4 decades of agony. His passing marked not only the end of a life steeped in physical torment, but ignited the final unraveling of a dynasty. The king, who had endured grotesque deformity and excruciating pain, succumbed quietly, yet the aftermath was anything but peaceful. His death triggered a succession crisis that plunged Europe into the War of Spanish Succession, reshaping the continent's geopolitical landscape for generations. The conditions surrounding his demise were macabre. His body, emaciated and fragile, had been ravaged by years of infection, surgeries, and chronic illness. Reports from the Spanish court describe a corpse pale, swollen in places from internal fluid buildup, and so delicate that handling it risked disintegration of his brittle bones. The embalming process, undertaken with limited knowledge and resources, proved challenging. In an attempt to preserve a semblance of regal dignity, embalmers battled the rapid decomposition exacerbated by the king's compromised condition, resulting in a poorly preserved body that fed rumors of royal curses and divine retribution. The funeral itself was a somber affair, shadowed by the palpable grief of a nation realizing it had lost more than a ruler. The event exposed the fragile state of the monarchy, with courtiers publicly mourning while privately scheming over the inheritance of power. His coffin was interred at El Escorial, the royal mausoleum, but even in death, Charles II's remains stirred fascination and horror, visitors remarking on the visible deformities that morphed the visage of a king into a haunting reminder of human frailty. Modern forensic investigations, centuries later, have peeled back the layers of myth surrounding Charles's afflictions. Through the examination of preserved documents, portraits, and genetic studies of the Habsburg remains, historians and medical researchers have pieced together a detailed diagnosis. The king's condition was primarily the result of severe congenital hydrocephalus, an abnormal accumulation of cerebrospinal fluid within the brain's ventricles combined with osteogenesis imperfecta, a hereditary disorder known as brittle bone disease. This genetic convergence explains the skull filled with water and the remarkably fragile, liquid-like quality of his bones. The extent of inbreeding within the Habsburg line profoundly exacerbated these conditions. Scientific analysis confirms that repeated cousin marriages amplified recessive genetic mutations, making Charles a living embodiment of genetic catastrophe. His developmental delays, facial deformities, and failure to produce an heir were all consistent with such syndromes. What history long feared as a curse or divine punishment is now understood as tragic genetics and the limits of contemporary knowledge. Charles II's legacy is a stark lesson on the dangers of royal inbreeding and medical ignorance. His tragic body was a harbinger for a collapsing empire and an unsettled continent. Through the lens of modern medicine, his story transcends royal horror tales to reveal profound scientific truths about heredity, disease, and the human cost of power's pursuit. The inbred king born with a skull full of water and liquid bones remains a chilling symbol, a morbid reminder of how bloodlines, biology, and history intertwine with devastating effect.